Is God's law still applicable today? Does the Old Testament teach modern Christians anything about social justice? What should the Christian's relationship be to Old Testament law? We'll talk about that and much more with a special guest today, Joel Mcdermott, on today's Theology on Air. All right, well, as always, thanks for listening to Theology on Air here at KPFT. KPFT.org is the place to go to learn about Houston's community-sponsored, listener-supported radio. That means that we cannot do this without you. We'll have an hour of conversation today, commercial-free, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. You can find me. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Lutheran here in Houston, flhouston.org. Or find out more about Theology on Tap here in Houston. That's at facebook.com/Theology on Tap Houston. We're a ministry that seeks to get young people together to talk about theological issues with maybe a craft beer in hand, maybe not a well-aged scotch, like my guest today might have a good recommendation for. But anyway, I am joined today by Joel Mcdermott. I've had Joel in Houston a couple times for some more formal debates on some important issues. I think debates that hopefully will continue to get watched on YouTube, and maybe we'll talk about those here in a little bit. But Joel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine.
Well, good deal. Well,
And
thanks.
Speaking of those debates we've done, I had a gentleman contact me just a couple days ago who is an Iranian-born Armenian Christian who writes about the basically the religious liberty issues that Iranian Christians are facing. And he said he watched my debate there with Paget, the recent one on social justice, and he says that was great. I need more resources on how God's law applies basically to the state.
Wow.
And stuff like that. So those debates, I mean, I'd never heard much traction come from that debate. I heard, a few things here and there when we first released it, but this is the first time for that debate somebody's come back and said, wow, this is really helpful. So, kudos for putting that on.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to that because, so Joel did two debates here in Houston, and one was on, so the last one was on sort of social justice, and this was when, this whole topic of social justice, at least we planned it, when this whole topic of social justice was really a kind of a big argument and fight within the Christian community. And it kind of in a way split along left and right lines, kind of like political, but Joel, I think, kind of threaded the needle and looked at it from a different point of view, which is what we're really going to be talking about today. And so, and Doug Paget is of the old emergent school, and he's, his position, I think, is more, he's obviously a very bright guy. I don't know how to say this, but, kind of a typical left-leaning, kind of liberal theologian, position. So we'll come back to that. Joel, you're best known for being a theonomist. Yes. I maybe that's not fair to say, but so a lot of people are going, theonomy, what's that? Let's define that quickly before we lose any listeners. What does it mean to be a theonomist? And maybe tell a little bit of your story, how you kind of came into believing, the theonomic claims and such.
Okay, I would take both of those. What is theonomy? In short, as you know, the word simply means God's law. Theos, nomos, God's law. So to a certain degree, every Christian has got some view of theonomy. But what does it take to be called a theonomist? Well, in the 1970s or so, actually much earlier, there began to be a strain of people wanting to say, hey, let's get serious about how does God's law, as taught in the Bible, Old and New Testaments, apply to society today, family, church, and state. And so they began to do a lot of writing, a lot of research, and answer these questions. And there's not a single kind of coherent set of principles everybody adhered to, but it was more of a school of thought. And so as kind of a theological definition that's come to pass, the way I've taught it, is that theonomy is a view of the biblical law, including some of Mosaic code, that still applies today, including some of the judicial laws. And so the work of a theonomist is to do a lot of exegesis and try to discern what applied only to Old Testament Israel, why we don't have to abstain from shellfish and whatnot today, versus why some of those things, however, still may apply, like the laws for restitution, the laws for what I'm thinking of, like, because we've talked about getting to the slavery issue on my book, the laws for returning fugitive slaves and things of that nature.
Right. Or the death
those
penalty.
have applications still outside of the old land of Israel? And we would argue absolutely they do. Those are laws of justice in society. So that's what a theonomist is. And again, some theonomists differ among themselves over what those laws apply, and we have some healthy discussion and debate.
When would you say that? Let me just quickly ask. You said when would you say that kind of school of thought kind of began? Like was it? I mean, Rushdoony is kind of considered a kind of grandfather of theonomy, but
in the 20th
obviously you'd say thought was okay. In
the 20th century, Rushdoony is the kind of primary figure who gets the ball rolling, and then those who kind of gathered around his orbit and became kind of disciples and then developed their own strains of it. Gregg Bahnson is a well-known apologist who also was an outspoken theonomist. Gary North, who's tailored a lot of his work to economics, biblical economics. He's a theonomist, and there are many others out there who more or less kind of overlapped with what we were doing, who might use that label or not. But Rushdoony. But now, a lot of my work has been historical, going back all the way into the Reformers and earlier times, seeing how before the label was around and being used, were there people arriving at these positions? And of course, some addressed it and rejected the need for Mosaic laws, like Calvin and certainly Luther, in some contexts, although then they would also apply them in other contexts. But the second generation of reformers, there was a notable writer named Johannes Piscator, who was at Heidelberg. Now, I'm getting it wrong off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and check. But I published a book of his several years ago called Disputations on the Judicial Laws of Moses, in which he argued that most of them are applicable. And there were several people who took his definitions and applied them, notably some of the Westminster divines, and that carried over into American Puritan theology. So there's a strain of thought along these lines that goes way back into the Reformers.
Yeah.
So
let me jump in, because again, immediately what can happen is whenever you kind of start to talk about this, is you say, yeah, some Old Testament laws apply. Immediately people do jump to the shellfish thing, right? I'm sure you've dealt with that forever. They immediately say, what? You want us to rebuild a temple and sacrifice animals? So generally speaking, because again, some of the listeners to this are going to be, they wouldn't even know maybe of these categories, but generally speaking, and the Bible doesn't lay this out clearly, but in the law, in the Old Testament law, you have, what we'd call moral laws, civil or judicial laws, and ceremonial laws. Hopefully I got all that right. And so we would all agree that the ceremonial laws dealing with sacrifice and priests and temples and animal slaughter have all been fulfilled, that Jesus is the sacrifice offered to God for the forgiveness of sin, and certain other ceremonial aspects or laws that are tied to the land. Like, so you talk about this in your book on the bounds of love, for example. You talk about, because and again, you mentioned it earlier, but to be clear, this work is ongoing, you would say, right? As a theonomist, you would say the work of sort of knowing what Old Testament judicial or civic laws would still apply, that's work that is still being done, right? I mean, there's not like a master list somewhere that we just say here, right?
Absolutely. There's ongoing discussion.
Okay.
And there's no, like you said, a master list. There's never been this applies and this doesn't, and that's theonomy. There's been some things that have been assumed. There have been a lot of things that have been discussed. But I still think a lot of those questions need better answers, which is why I delved into the bounds of love and then later the book of Consuming Fire, to try to discern where these lines are drawn, because to me they're not clear. People who want to reject which by the way, the majority report in kind of evangelicalism is that the Old Testament law is completely set aside, and we're under this kind of New Testament dispensation. But there's so much in Scripture that appeals to the Old Testament law. And so when I say we have to go back and discern what applies and what doesn't, number one, that applies to every Christian because we all do it implicitly.
Mm-hmm.
And second of all, there's, for the theonomist, yes, of course we agree with the vast majority of Christianity that says these ceremonial laws are fulfilled in Christ, no longer to be performed anymore. But that doesn't mean you can set aside the whole law, and no Christian does, because what does Christ, the Pharisees come to Christ and say, what is the greatest of the commandments? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, the first of those commandments is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and the second of those is from right in the middle of Leviticus 19, in the middle of all kinds of odd laws about don't shave the corners of your beards, don't wear two types of cloth together, that were clearly ceremonial, applying to life in Old Testament Israel. But then right there in the middle of them is also love your neighbor as yourself. Don't put a stumbling block in front of a blind man. Don't show partiality to the rich over the poor. These are things obviously that apply at all times and all ages. They're God's levels, God's standards for justice and for righteousness. So every Christian has to go back to the law and discern what applies and what doesn't, because that's what Christ is doing right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't pick up Leviticus and it says, okay, here are all the moral laws that are transcendent and rooted in the character and nature of God, so they apply at all time for all people. Like most, even a lot of it, actually, now that I think about it, a lot of evangelical Christians wouldn't even agree with that. And certainly within, I think, what I would call liberal Christianity, there isn't even the idea that, that the character of God is transcendent for all people. I think, it's kind of like, whatever God you worship, that's the God that, you're accountable to. And so we would say, though, that no, there's only one God, and all people, Romans 1, are accountable to that one God. So anyway, that's kind of the moral law.
Right. Well, but even the liberals, though, are the first ones to run to the laws about taking care of the poor and the widow and the orphan, and saying these apply in all times and all places, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's
they're
good
doing
point.
the same thing we're talking about. We just need to have a little bit more even level discussion on these things.
Yeah. But again, in the Old Testament, it's like you don't see, okay, here are the moral laws, here are the civil laws, and here are the ceremonial laws. They're all lumped together. And that's
in many ways, yes, that's the case. You do have certain areas where they're clustered together, but in many other areas they're all overlapping, and it's your job to discern how these apply. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that then the conflict kind of becomes then, well, what is the kind of Christian relationship to the state? Because obviously in the New Testament, and this is kind of a common thing that people would say. I mean, I guess I might say it. In the New Testament, you see, for example, Christians are under a wide variety of government situations. I mean, the Roman Empire, of course, obviously, and local governments. And, you don't see Paul and Jesus, espousing revolution, overthrow the dictators, create a new empire. And rather, you kind of tend to see calls for obedience and living peacefully among your neighbors, for the proclamation of the gospel. And so then they look at the Old Testament and say, well, that's a theocracy where you have this, this people called by God, God is their king, and then he establishes kings. And so it's a very different situation where there's kind of group of people, they have control over the political situation, whereas in the New Testament, they have no control. So how could you be arguing? I mean, this would be a question to you, right? How could a theonomist be arguing for, particular civic laws when Christians are essentially a powerless people in their political environment in the New Testament?
Well, it'd be that last sentence I think I would object to. Yes, we're called to live in peace, and we're even called to be subject to tyranny in many cases. I mean, when Paul's writing Romans 13 to be subject to the powers that be, we assume, from the best of our knowledge, that was written under the reign of the Emperor Nero, who was a murderous, crazy man. And the Roman Empire was far from a Christian government. So there is an extent to which we are called to be peaceable and even submit to tyranny and high levels of taxation and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean we are, to use the words you kind of threw out there, powerless people in society, especially as time goes on and things, God's providence develops in history, such that we develop democratic institutions where it is all about people's voices. the more Christian a society becomes, or the more visible the Christian message becomes in society, I think it becomes incumbent upon us to speak the truth, so that any particular instance, whether it's religious liberty or simple justice in the criminal justice system, our people as private individuals, even as pulpits, we need to be announcing what is God's truth to the land. So, you know, you don't see Paul calling for revolution, but you do see him use every avenue and every venue he's given, even public venues, even public courts, to stand up and speak the truth of God, however it's relevant in that particular venue. So that today, if we have, you know, institutionalized injustices in our land, the whole large segments of the prison system, if not the whole thing, is an unbiblical concept. When if a guy commits simple theft, we lock him in a cage for 10 years. That doesn't make any sense by any principle of justice anywhere, except a really weird part of our history that came out of secular, environmental, almost Marxist law. That, you know, that we can change the guy's environment and change him into a better person over a period of time. And of course, we don't even try to do that in the penal system. So in the Bible, in God's law, he says, no, if someone steals, they should pay back, and they should pay back double restitution as a punishment for their crime. Okay, that makes sense. That's just. And Christians ought to be speaking about this. We are to speak out on behalf of the poor and the widow and the orphan. And Christ said, those who visit me in prison as well. So this is these things all make sense for when we have a voice, we should be raising it up. And just one more aspect on that is when Peter and Paul, or Peter and John, are preaching the gospel in Acts, and they're hauled before the authority of it, they don't just lay down and roll over and say, well, okay. They do say, we must obey God rather than men. Well, that's not a call to revolution, but it is them recognizing that there are lines we have to draw in what we speak and what we stand for as Christians and what we do. I mean, sure, we may submit to tyranny when it's a certain level of taxation or certain weird laws that we don't really like or disagree with. But when you start telling us to do things that cause us to defy what God has told us to do, now you're getting into an area where we have to make a decision. Do we submit to this? Yeah. So that, as Francis Schaeffer popularized in the 1980s, there are times that demand Christians be involved in civil disobedience. I would say the civil rights movement, to a large extent, was one of those times in our history. And certainly there are many other applications. We're not powerless.
Let me ask this. I think that when people hear theonomists speak, what they hear is a Christian's insistence that systems be overthrown, and Old Testament law, you'd wipe away with all the laws on the books, and Old Testament law be, kind of written in code, which, I mean, actually it wouldn't bother me, but anyway, but that's kind of what people hear, I think. Now I say that and people are going to be like, oh, you're in favor of the death penalty for 26 things. And we can maybe come back to that, but let me put it like this. I think, but let me ask this. Are theonomists trying to develop are you trying to, build into the culture an appreciation for God's law that will eventually bear fruit through sowing and through teaching and so on and so forth? That's one thing, right? That's different from saying, we have to institute this, kind of in some kind of top-down way. I think people assume that theonomists want themselves, in a way, want revolution, to the society but I guess when I hear someone like Bahnson speak or something, or read him, I think what they're trying to do is promote among Christians, because that's where you would start, an understanding that, look, God's law still applies. Let's start there.
Yeah. So how does it come to pass in society? The vast majority of us who are spokesmen for the movement have always said, you will never get to the point of actually changing laws to honor God without there being some level of revival in the land. In other words, the disposition towards God's law has to be in people's hearts to begin with. There is no scenario in which any of us have called for hey, let's grab the reins of power and impose God's law on an unwilling populace, and then just start, as some have said, instituting death penalties for those who disagree. I mean, that's just so radically wrong. Now, historically, there are a very small minority of people who have kind of aligned with the theonomic movement in general, broadly, that have come out of the Reformed and Covenanter tradition, a very small remaining segment of the Reformed tradition, who again, by the way, divided. There's very great things they stood for historically, but they have also been very clear historically that, well, no, we don't need a majority to agree with us or not. If we get power, we make the laws to honor God because that's what he calls us to do. And I disagree with that notion of government. And most of us do too, the vast majority of us. And when we argue on things like that, a lot of the times those fellows will end up saying, well, we're not even part of the theonomic movement. We don't even call ourselves theonomists because you guys don't agree with us.
You would be considered a liberal by them, right?
By some of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Although, to be honest, most of them I've actually talked to are just solid Reformed guys who grew up in a particular tradition, and they would look at me and say, though we disagree, we're brothers. And we, again, there's so many strains here. There's also a strain of people who may not be actual Covenanters in that narrow Scottish Reformed tradition, yet who follow the Westminster Confession or the kind of the old establishment Reformed view of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, in which the state did enforce religious laws, and they just want to bring that back. Well, to me, they're not exegeting God's law so much as trying to return to an old tradition, a bygone way of life in which the state had power. And when I look at that historically, I tell these guys, they didn't derive that from studying scripture, not even Mosaic law. They derived that from inheriting the Roman system. That was ancient Rome, which was inherited by the Catholic Church, which was then transformed and inherited by the Protestant churches. Yeah. Luther, Calvin, and all those guys, Zwingli to a lesser extent, but also the English reformers and all those guys.
There's an interview you did with an author of a book that was too expensive for me and too long for me to read, but you probably know what I'm talking about. He talked about the difference between the city law and country law.
Yes.
And I don't know if you remember that off the top of your head, but that would be an interview worth watching, and I'm sure a book worth reading. It's kind of fascinated me ever since, and it's kind of like on my to-do list one of these days to really understand. But basically, your argument is that what you find in the Bible, I think his argument as well would be essentially principles of law, but that it's a case law system, which is to say we have to ferret out the application of that law over and over and over. And America is essentially a case law understanding that we don't have a law, which would be city law, that would say this is the law and this is how it's to be applied in all situations. But actually we have a case law where we have a precedent, and we look back at it and we say, well, this was what was done before, and we evaluate it. I don't know if you might want to speak to that for a couple of minutes, just kind of an understanding of law, because I think that when people think of Old Testament law, they think draconian rules, everyone gets executed, mind your P's and Q's, don't pick up sticks on the Sabbath, the government's going to enforce religious laws. But actually, it's really more of a case law kind of understanding, if I remember the interview and understood it correctly. And that means we ferret out the meaning over time.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. There are aspects of the Old Testament law that were very strict that don't apply anymore because of the ceremonial nature of the land and the temple system. But as far as what you're talking to is case law and precedent, that's the common law system we inherited from England. And yes, American law is based on a case law system, so that you have a general principle such as thou shalt not murder. And it's over time, as the court tries cases, that they develop the distinctions of, well, okay, this applies, this doesn't. And a lot of those distinctions are already inherent in biblical law. If you go back far enough, you see that the English system is based largely on that. The problem is, coming out of the Roman system was the opposite view, which is statute law. And this is an attempt to codify everything. The state says what the law is, and there's very detailed law. And when a case goes to court, there has to be this recourse. Well, what does the statute say? And well, okay, if it's if it's a assault with a deadly weapon, well, he hits you with a golf club. That's not a weapon. There's this wrangling over words. But the problem is that after the Norman invasion of England in 1066, that system came in and they kind of overlapped. So, and in America now we have both of those systems operating simultaneously in different ways. So it's hard to distinguish between the two, but what the gentleman's getting at is we should not try to codify everything and write down every definition of every law. But if you don't do that, it eventually gets ferreted out in common law anyway. So the bottom line is both of those systems need to be compared with what does God's law say, and the principles align there properly. And in general, men need to be left free. The problem of what happens is the civil law system is a top-down looking system, and it's governed executively oftentimes, so that you create this enormous body of case law. Somebody will say, well, there's a problem within the environment and people polluting each other's water supplies. Well, then we got to create this enormous executive agency with all of these regulations, thousands of pages. And the only people that know what they might say are the bureaucrats. And when they come say, well, you violated this, you are guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. Okay, now all of our systems work like that to a certain degree, except our root common law system is just the opposite. You're innocent until proven guilty. And so we have those two systems overlap. And in Western history, specifically English history, you see those conflicts happening in the Reformation in England specifically, where the Levelers and John Lilburne, Freeborn John, and these guys, they're resisting the executive agency tyrannies that control publishing and control every aspect of life with these tyrannical laws and fines. And you can be dragged into the king's court, which was not a court of common law. It was an executive court where you're guilty until you're proven innocent. And they protested against these things. And they this is where the civil disobedience comes into play. These guys were saying, this is not God's way of life. This is not what a Christian society would look like. And they were willing to go to jail and become the test cases and sit in dungeons for years in order to protest these things. And out of that comes the Pilgrim movement and the Puritan movement that comes to America. And when they come here, they say, okay, we're not going to allow those types of courts anymore. And for a long time, they didn't. For a long time they didn't. There's a lot of interesting history on that, but with our own history beginning pretty early with things like the militia acts and the Whiskey Rebellion, slowly these elements begin to creep back in because there's this mentality of man not trusting their neighbor. And we always get this idea in our heads, well, somebody ought to pass a law to stop this. And that's what we do. And then we create standing armies that we call police forces to enforce those laws. And the next thing, we're right back where we started. And, our forefathers through the Boston Tea Party over what amounted to maybe a few percent tax. And these days we submit to 10, 20, 30, 40% levels of taxation. And it's normal to us. And we don't revolt. We don't throw tea parties and all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah. Well, they tried after TARP, right? When we started the new Tea Party in 08 or 09, and it's like what we just did as a result of COVID-19, whether you agree with it or not, was 3 or 4 times TARP, and no one bats an eye because I guess a Republican did it. So, and I've said several times through doing the radio show that we can talk about social justice issues all day, and I think they are important, especially as you see another shooting, tragically, and subversion of justice in Georgia this last couple of weeks that's now coming to light. That's all important. However, one day, our currency is going to be so devalued that nothing else is going to, matter much, and that will lead to real war and real tyranny and really deleterious effects. So, That's maybe
Right.
another issue. And, the Bible does actually talk about, sound money and such. And
All those things. Well, here, let me back up a little bit.
yeah.
There was something else I wanted to say on that question you asked about
Hmm.
theonomists and imposing the law and what is the nature of theonomy and stuff. And one of the things, unfortunately, that we have done, and I've participated in it, is to focus on the civil and judicial aspects of the Old Testament law. And that was necessary because it lacked emphasis in all of American life.
Hmm.
So, but in emphasizing that for so long, we've given the impression that we're exclusively focused on these issues. And what theonomists have not done very well is to paint a picture of what a life under God's law for self-discipline, self-government looks like. We've talked about self-government, family government, and those things, but we've not actually done a lot on the private side of self-government. What does God's law look like in there? And I think that's where we've gotten ourselves in so much trouble with the political divides that happen. So, for example, when the issue of poverty comes up, a liberal will say, well, this is the state's job to provide welfare and all these things. And a conservative will say, no. And both of those have a piece of God's truth at work. And both of them are also either mishandling or neglecting aspects of God's truth too. And all of it's God's law. And I guess where I've come in and where I've gotten myself in trouble is pointing to both sides and say, no, you liberals can't say that's the state's job. It's not the state's job. And well, so they quit listening to me. And then I say to the conservative, well, it is not the state's job, but it should be our job, and we should be sacrificing and giving to help these people. And so, but they dismiss me as a liberal bleeding heart of some sort. And so the problem is you have these sides polarizing over fragments of God's law, when in reality, God's law is much more holistic and much more demanding of us, that if we want to have the kind of free society we talk about as conservatives, especially, and libertarians, if you're not out there actively taking care of the problems of society through private and charitable means, you're almost ceding the ground to the liberals, because they're going to come in with the program that actually gets the things done. They're not just talking about how do I protect me and mine from intrusions.
Right.
They don't appear selfish, even though we can make arguments that they are being selfish with other people's money. But in the long run, the bottom line is there are needs in society that need to be addressed. And if we're not addressing those through private means, we're going to lose the argument. And I think history attests to the fact that we've consistently lost the argument.
Yeah. For example, let's think, if you just take kind of modern welfare principles, right? Helping the needy. You see in the New Testament, he who does not work does not eat. And you'll have Christians, people say, yeah, see there, there you have it. That's the law. There you have it. And then on the other hand, you have the, amazingly, the word escapes me, but the outer edge of your farm territory, right, in the Old Testament, where
the gleaning laws, yes,
the gleaning laws. Thank you. And so it's a kind of welfare system, if you will, where you say, look, we're not going to harvest everything we can. Well, you can imagine if there's a farmer who owns a lot of, all of the, major territory and area, but he doesn't obey the gleaning laws, and he take, we're going to take the rotten apples that fell, and they're going to make cider into that, right? It's not good enough to eat, but we can do something with it. And that's money, that I can make. So if he disobeys that law, and then people go hungry, and then there's a need for, well, you know what? We need to pass a law. We need to pass another law that is a tax on top of whatever, because now we have all these people that we have to feed. So anyway, I mean, let me put it like this. If we're to look at that issue, for example, this is a leading question because it's a rhetorical question, but don't we have to look at both of those sorts of things and say, okay, what does this look like? What does helping our neighbor look like, but also what does personal responsibility look like? And the conservative response tends to be, what's mine is mine. And that leads to then this vacuum where the state has to come in. I mean, and that's what what I think you're getting at in your slavery book.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if we kind of want to pivot to that, but what I glean from that, if you will, is that we need to understand certain histories of our country to understand certain modern realities of our, of our situation. But before we go there, I want to ask one question, because I think it's really important. which goes all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. But I promise I'm going to pivot to those kind of more modern issues. And if we go longer than an hour, we can do like bonus content on YouTube or something.
Sounds good.
In your debate with J.D. Hall, so let me just say quickly, Google theonomy debate, J.D. Hall, Joel McDermott, and it'll come right up on YouTube. People are still watching it. I listened to it again the other night. There's a point in your cross-examination where you're asking JD, have you read this person? 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 And he has to say, no, 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 no. And I think your point was theonomy, yes, like you said, is kind of a 20th century, to a degree, a concept that maybe needed to be reclaimed in the 20th century. But your argument was that people argued similar things from the Reformation on. His argument was more or less that it's a modern innovation and the whole movement should be done away with. And so maybe talk about that then. I was interested in, without maybe naming names, but you do feel that, and maybe this ties into that common law notion as well, but you do feel though that for say 300 to 400 years, 500 years, there were people who weren't just subservient to the Roman law they'd essentially inherited in Middle Europe, but they were thinking about the application of biblical Old Testament law. Yes. I mean, you do feel that way. JD say doesn't, but you do.
Absolutely. I think if I remember correctly, and you say you listened to that debate just the other day, I can't imagine, I haven't listened to that in years now, but I do remember that portion of the debate. It was early on, and he had brought up in the debate that the confessions, the Reformed confessions, so the London Baptist Confession of Faith and the Westminster Confession of Faith, deny the possibility of theonomy because they say the judicial laws no longer apply except insofar as they use this odd word, the general equity thereof applies. And so his argument was that the general equity is some kind of spiritualized concept, and therefore there is no obligation confessionally for Reformed or Reformed Baptist Christians to adhere to the judicial laws of the Old Testament. And I was trying to establish the foundation that he doesn't know what he's talking about when he talks about what the general equity means and what the people who wrote that phrase meant for it to mean. And of course, the pedigree of that term goes all the way back to the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Johannes Piscator, and he got it from a Jewish Christian convert before him who was an expert in the law, named Emmanuel Tremellius and Francisco Junius. Those guys' doctrine had been picked up by William Perkins, who was you could say he was the teacher at, I believe it was Cambridge or Oxford, of Puritan theology, of all the famous Puritans who came out. Certainly all of those Westminster divines who were there working on these documents had been trained in theology either directly under Perkins or having read Perkins' works. And he distinguished between general equity and particular equity. General equity meaning those laws of the Old Testament that apply to all times and all places, and particular equity being those that are particular only to the state of Israel. So when you look at it like that, that phrase takes on an entirely different meaning than some spiritualized concept of, well, God's law is a good general principle out there we should all follow. Mm-hmm. So that's true, and it was even true for some of the Reformed Baptist authors who had been involved in writing the London Baptist Confession or its predecessors. And also at the time, there was a document circulating defending, because the English Reformation did not like Anabaptists at all. In fact, in the early days, many of them were executed, and they were persecuted, and they were called revolutionaries and anarchists and everything. And so there was an early document about that same time, published in defense of Anabaptism. And I don't remember who exactly the authors were, if they're actually even known, but I think Hans Ernalius may have been one of them, who was a Reformed Baptist theologian. And those guys specifically in there said, we're not revolutionaries. We're not even against the government policing religious doctrines. For example, we believe in the punishment of atheists and blasphemers. I believe they added blasphemers, but atheists certainly were in there. So these guys were in favor of an establishmentarian view as Reformed Baptists. And so that's
Mhm.
why I went through that list of all the famous Reformed Baptists I could find. I said, have you actually read this guy? No. Have you read this guy? No. Have you read this? No. Have you read this guy? So you don't know anything about the theology whatsoever on
Yeah.
this point
Yeah.
of the guys who wrote these documents. And then so he had to default, well, I've got the document itself. I can read it for what it says. Well, you don't get to say what it says unless you understand what it was meant to
Mhm.
say by the people who wrote it.
And
That
and
was what
just
that
to
whole exchange was about.
Yeah, and just to define a few terms, like, so JD in that debate is a Reformed Baptist, you're a
Yes.
Presbyterian, right? So there are different kind of strains of Calvinism, if you will, kind of parsed out historically, and they have slightly different, so in some ways identical but different confessions. The Westminster, the London Baptist Confession of 1689 is what he would hold to, and you would hold to, say, the Westminster
Yeah.
Confession, right? Okay.
Yeah, and
And
then a
so,
funny detail was actually there was a later version or a later printing of the London Baptist Confession that Charles Spurgeon picked up and popularized
mm,
and actually changed the wording on that exact part of the
mm,
confession
mm,
where it says the general equity of the law being of moral use only. And Spurgeon's version said of modern use only, changing the nuance of it. And of course, those guys were oblivious to all of this. And I'm the one that actually pointed out to virtually the whole modern Reformed Baptist world that this was actually existed. And
interesting. Yeah.
of course, they didn't like that very much. But anyway,
Yeah. Well,
moving
yeah.
on to the question you asked, were there guys at the time who were not just following the kind of the Reformed establishment tradition that was inherited from Rome, but were actively trying to make exegetical adjustments to? There definitely were. And there were differences of opinion within the Westminster Confession assembly that wrote that confession. There were guys who said it means one thing and guys who said, no, it means a much more narrow thing. And so there were discussions and disagreements over what the civil law should be at that time. And then, of course, you had the leveler movement, like I said, with John Lilburn, who had even more nuanced views that would be picked up in the American system. So there were certainly guys working on these things at the time. There were many nuances.
Yeah. Yeah. So my door is really squeaky and my son's coming in, but yeah. So, you would say though that, I guess to try to put it in today's situation, what I'm aiming to do, what I want to do as a follower of Jesus is I want to be a whole counsel of God Christian. I want to understand and appreciate the whole Bible. And what happens a lot today in the Christian church, and this is kind of the meta narrative, is that we, and I think I might even be stealing this phrase from an article from you, we're kind of like New Testament pietists in many cases, right? All of Christianity kind of gets boiled down to loving other people like Jesus and being kind and having a kind of certain moral aptitude and kind of, personal charm or levity. That's kind of what Christianity kind of becomes. And over time, it's a bit like it's a kind of thin gruel, to kind of be fed that. And if we really want to understand, who Jesus is, well, we really need to understand his context. Well, and we often forget when we read the New Testament that the New Testament did not exist during the New Testament being written. The only thing that Paul had when he says Scripture is the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, that's really interesting because Paul is sitting here saying that this is what is inspired and God breathed. And so that is the Bible of the New Testament church. And so then you have to kind of ask, well, did they have the kind of view that we often have, when they understand Christianity? Was it basically like, we'll just kind of follow Jesus and love other people, and that's kind of the end of the story? Or was there careful work even in the early church of kind of trying to figure out, well, how does this apply? Like what does this look like civically? And what would your standard be? What would you have to look to? Well, it has to be the Old Testament. Well, yeah, now we have the New Testament, though. Jesus is risen from the dead, so the law is fulfilled. Well, yeah. And some is obviously done away with. Galatians and circumcision and all of that. But certainly the moral law of God contains, and some of the civic laws are effectively governed by your understanding of morality. Why is it really wrong to use the example that's always used Why is it really wrong to have a roof with no, barrier around the edge? Isn't it because if you don't love your neighbor that they'll fall off and die? So, I mean, isn't there a moral component around then the modern equivalent of putting a fence around your swimming pool so that your neighbor's 2-year-old doesn't drown, right? I mean, and so within modern Christians, what I find irritating, because either evangelicals sort of have a very superficial view of what Christianity is, and liberals seem to have virtually no regard for the law of God as abiding. No offense to my liberal friends out there. In both situations, it seems like they're not kind of doing the hard work of trying to figure out like how the law of God still applies. And maybe theonomists are nuts, but at least they're, at least they take it seriously is kind of how I think about it. I don't think you're nuts, by the way. I'm just saying, and so it's like, well, we should at least be efforting to not be just New Testament pietists, and we should really be thinking about this whole counsel of God and this whole, the way that Christianity really is about the whole revelation of the Bible, and that we only take away those things that we're certain we take away, right? So like if God himself says, okay, this no longer applies. So the eating of shellfish, circumcision, ceremonial aspects of law, and then maybe certain civic laws. I mean, you would agree that there are civic laws and judicial laws that would no longer apply. They're not ceremonial, I think. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think the basic answer is yes. There are civil and judicial laws that don't apply anymore. And I would say the reason they don't apply is that they're punishments, or the reason they existed in some cases was because they were ceremonial. For example, if a bride is found to be a betrothed girl is found not to be a virgin on her wedding night, it was not just a divorce that happened. She was to be taken to her father's porch and stoned to death. When the evidence of her non-virginity is presented, she was to be stoned to death, not just put to death, but stoned to death. And again, pay attention to details, because there are different forms of punishment mandated in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's by fire, sometimes it's by sword, sometimes it's just left general, sometimes it's specified as stoning. So does that make sense that we would still do that today? No. But for most people, it's just because it seems barbaric or it seems very strange. But in reality, it's very ceremonial as to what God's holy nation Israel was, his bride, and several other aspects that are just ceremonial I won't go into. So, we don't even apply that penalty anymore, let alone that specific type of a penalty. So the whole thing to me was ceremonial. And there are other ceremonies that were like that. The city that is given over to a false prophet, saw false prophecy. The whole city was to be burned down to the ground, and everybody in it killed. Well, why would you kill the children? That doesn't make any sense unless there's some very, very serious ceremonial aspect to this. And when you look at God destroying the entire city of Jerusalem in AD 70 for its apostasy, suddenly you see the typology of these things. It makes more sense. So that if, 2 miles down the road, there's a small town where they have a false prophet and everybody's flocking to him, we're not to pull the tanks in there and blow the town away and kill everybody in it. That's just crazy. Or anything like that. I don't want to create a straw man either, but this is a point on which I would differ from some of my theonomist friends, and it's why I sat down and wrote The Bounds of Love. And then I defended this very principle, the ceremonial divide over some of the death penalties, in my second book, A Consuming Fire, which is an intense look at the concept of holiness and most holiness and how it relates to some of the penalties in the Old Testament. So I did that. Now, it's interesting. You said, haven't we become, as American Christians, kind of these New Testament pietists where we just love our neighbor like Jesus loved people? And
which is the law.
Exactly. That's why I wrote the title on the first book, The Bounds of Love. Well, love is not just an emotion, a sentiment we feel, although, by the way, we neglect that badly as Christians, the emotional aspect of things. But love, it has content. It has moral content to it. There are ethical boundaries. Love is about boundaries in your life. what you would do for somebody and what you would not do to somebody, what you would not allow to be done to somebody. And so when we talk about, so I can affirm the statement, yes, we should just love each other as Jesus loved. But what does it look like to love somebody in terms of the civil realm? What does it look like to love somebody in terms of doing business? Is it okay to, scrape a little off the top for myself to overcharge somebody? Is that loving my neighbor? Well, of course not. But that's a civil and economic thing, isn't it? If somebody is stealing from somebody else, how do we remedy that? Do we kill the person who stole? Is that loving our neighbor? It may make somebody feel righteous in our sense of moral superiority that our fallen natures have, but it's not loving your neighbor. It's not even loving the person who got stolen from, because that doesn't give him his stuff back to lock somebody in a cage or to kill them, which thankfully we don't do. But it certainly wouldn't be loving to the criminal either, which we're also obligated to do. So, loving your neighbor has a wide variety of things. Everything you do in life, whether it's in your family, your church, your business, your state, your podcasts, or whatever, you have to ask these questions. What does it mean to love somebody? It's not just being nice. And in fact, being nice sometimes gets you in deep trouble and is an injustice in society. Right. So
I always am haunted by that passage, which is in our 3-year lectionary. I think it's Ezekiel 33, but it's essentially if you see, it's the watchtower kind of metaphor. If you see something going on and you don't say something, you're as guilty and as liable to death. It's like, and so, so sometimes, being nice, being a people pleaser, that's exactly who you're being, though. You're not speaking the truth. And so on the other hand, there can be a zealousness for truth that can overtake a person, and truth maybe can get redefined. And so those are all things. You
have the meme of Karen going around today. Unfortunate for anyone named Karen, but
yeah, my wife loves this Karen meme. Yeah. I don't know. She's kind of an uptight woman, I gather, right? Who, I don't know, is telling everyone what to do. I don't know. But,
yeah, she's kind of the helicopter mom of everyone who is willing to call the authorities at the drop of a hat, because it's like if you saw Over the Hedge, the movie, where it's the homeowners association director, where she's measuring everybody's grass and citing writing fines when everything's wrong. That's kind of that kind of person.
So in other words, she's a typical theonomist, is what you're saying. Okay.
Some of them, certainly.
Yeah. The podcast is going to end in about 5 minutes. But I want to go ahead and say to those listening on the podcast, we're going to keep recording a little bit on Zoom. We're going to put the whole thing on YouTube. And so there's going to be some stuff we're going to get to here in a few minutes that you're really going to want to listen to. So definitely do find that. In fact, we've just kind of set the stage, I think, to get to Joel's kind of interesting, the more interesting part of the story. But Joel, in about 5 minutes, when I bring the podcast to a close, that's why. Okay. But we're going to keep going on YouTube, and I'll kind of edit in all the music and stuff later. In about, so let me just say, let me go back. So in about 2015, I started doing a radio show at KPFT. At the time, it was called Sin Boldly. And it was just kind of me. And now I do this thing, Theology on Air, this show, Theology on Air, with some other folks, still also with KPFT, same time slot and all that. But when I was doing my own show, it was more of a kind of current events, theological. It kind of started out kind of apologetically, but it got into more kind of Christian worldview-ish. Yeah. And so I'd stumble across your articles because I set up an RSS feed, and this, American Vision kind of articles kept coming up on it. I don't even know how, but I remember one in particular. It was where you were criticizing John Piper, who was really opposed to gun control. And I don't want to talk about gun control, don't worry. But that is where it was clear that there were people who kind of thought that there was a kind of problem with a kind of, as we said, kind of a New Testament piety or pietism in general that didn't actually have a comprehensive biblical view, perhaps, of living out the Christian life. And that was kind of the first time I'd kind of heard that. And there's a whole thing about two kingdoms that we should talk about too, but maybe we'll save that for a whole other day. Maybe we could do a debate on that or something. But but then, and then around that time, I ended up, some Facebook friends of mine were abolitionists. So I was like, what is that? Well, they're people who, not only are pro-life, but they actually believe that the only, justifiable view of abortion is that it should be abolished. And that's what we should be working on, not to just kind of try to bide our time, try to get Roe v. Wade overturned, but actually to work towards its complete abolition. Yeah. A sentiment which I largely agree with, although I disagree with some of their founding principles, perhaps. Anyway, but around that time, I was more aware of your work, and those kind of issues kind of came together in some interesting ways. And around that time, you wrote a book about slavery, which we did a whole interview several years ago, and it's on YouTube, so people can look up Sin Boldly or Joel McDermott, Slavery. It'll come up on YouTube. It's out there. And but that seemed to be a bit of a turning point for you. It seemed like, for me, and as an outside observer, tell me if I'm wrong, it seemed like, you were kind of doing more conventional, if you will, theonomy, biblical worldview defense, and then all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute, Joel just became a social justice warrior. Yeah. And that's what people said about you. And they didn't read your book on slavery, perhaps, or even know that you had written it. All of a sudden, they just knew that you said things like, we should listen to what people who are involved with Black Lives Matter are saying. Yeah. And so podcast listeners, that's what we're going to be talking about on YouTube. Okay. But until next time, I do want to encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed. That's our tagline at the end of every podcast, Joel. So there you go, some inside scoop. So for YouTube listeners, and I do hope people go to that. Anyway, talk about that a little bit. Talk about what was going on with you at that time, and that transition into the new Joel McDermott, as some people might say.
Well, you said it seemed to be a turning point, and I would have to confess it certainly was a turning point. It was a turning point in the sense that you drive your car through the intersection and get hit by a truck and get turned a different direction by outside force. My work on theonomy was, how do the bounds of love apply to the state? And I have rightly been accused of being a libertarian. Whether you put a capital L on that or not doesn't work. And I don't hold all the principles, like the natural law principles, how libertarians would justify their views. But as Rushdoony even said, that the closest thing to biblical law is a radical libertarianism. In other words, small state. We don't want this big statist. A large state is a state that can take your rights away, et cetera, socialism, all that kind of stuff. So I'm pursuing biblical law, and how does this apply to the state? And one of the things that stands out to me the more I do it is how far we've allowed ourselves to let the executive and enforcement sides of the law grow. So I start looking at the doctrine of police, the history of police, the immunity laws that police and prosecutors enjoy, and some of the outfall of that, and the whole concept and history of prison. Is that biblical? What is the biblical law? How would biblical law apply to the entire criminal justice system in the United States? And I began to look at that, and I say, I want to write a book based on my study of the criminal justice system and what the Bible says it ought to be. Well, one of the things that comes out in biblical law is that if you were to steal from somebody and you were not able to make restitution for your theft, you had to get into a system of indentured servitude so that you could pay off what you stole and the penalty thereof. And I think in the modern times, even we have versions of that mixed in our system in the concept of community service. If you're required to do community service, well, that's a form of indentured servitude. So we're not completely opposed to this idea. And if there's a deadbeat father who won't pay his child support, there are many states, if not most, that will garnish his paycheck to go to pay the child support. So, well, that's basically the same thing. You're forcing him to work, and then you're taking the fruits of his labor to pay for what he's legally required to pay for. So I wanted to make all these arguments, but you can't go through that, what the Bible teaches on those subjects, without bringing up the word slavery. because that's what the Bible calls it. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to write a short study on why what happened here in the United States with the race-based slavery that we had is not the same thing as in the Bible. And there are a lot of guys in the movement who came out, unfortunately, who were from a background of the old Southern Presbyterian Church, and they have very rosy views of the Confederacy and slavery, and it's terrible history. And as I began to develop my study, I began to read all that stuff, and I began to question. I was like, well, wait a minute, this is not right. These slaves weren't well treated everywhere. It wasn't rosy. And I just began to walk through and write. I ended up writing a whole ethical judicial history of the slave laws and slave society in the South. And then I also had to write how they justified it theologically and why they were wrong to say these scriptural laws applied to that. I ended up writing what is now almost a 500-page book on the problem of slavery in Christian America. And it was, I would say it's probably my most scholarly work. It's very, very, it's readable, but it's dense as far as facts and logic and footnotes go.
And so you got lambasted by those who actually would say, and I've had people, I won't say who've told me, look, slavery is a biblical office.
Absolutely.
Right. And
well,
so they're going, hey, look, you know, and these would be maybe kind of Old Testament, you know, maybe even theonomist or whatever. They say, hey, slavery is a biblical office. So careful now, because that was how it was defended in America. But then you had other people who kind of, again, the fruit of it, they said, oh, Joel's a liberal now.
Absolutely. And of course, this goes back, like we talked about earlier, there are some very small fringe radical groups who, to them, everybody's a liberal. So if I left, if they thought, well, Joe's going to be one of us one day, and we're going to have, you know, this new help and this great mind with a platform and all that. And that's not my delusion, by the way. People actually said that. And then I depart from their view. Oh, he's gone liberal, you know. Yeah. And if you so much as say Southern slavery was not biblical, in some of those circles, you're considered a Marxist. I mean, like literally what they used to call red Republicans. You know, Lincoln was considered a red Republican, which was essentially a Marxist in the language of the time. So, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the history has carried over, the institution has carried over, and a lot of the people I saw in my circles were the first to defend everything the police did when there was especially a person of color involved. Like there was no benefit of the doubt given to the person of color, every benefit of the doubt given to the police. Whereas if you reverse roles, they would reverse roles and be on my side on issues. So I began to realize and then the floodgates opened. People, I've got, you know, screenshots of people in that movement telling me I don't understand how bad black culture is, and the things begin to fall in place really quickly, that there are a lot of people here who are anti-civil rights movement who wish we still did live in a segregated society. And there are many people who hold to doctrines called kinism, which is just a distillation of that segregationist view, that say whites and blacks shouldn't even marry. And when I began writing on that topic, the floor fell out under my following, and I realized that a tremendous section of the following of the Christian Reconstruction movement, or at least that was aligning itself with it, was of that mentality. And so that's what I had to navigate. When I wrote a book on slavery, it was, you know, to quote Gandalf, things have been set in motion that cannot be undone. It was, I think that was Gandalf, by the way. I'm no aficionado. It was just one thing led to another, and there was opposition from so many quarters, to where there are people that are kind of Holocaust revisionists who are pro-Hitler. There's so many lines of former Klansmen and stuff that are all underneath this movement and found shelter under it all along, that when you start getting to their sacred cow, then they put their wheels in motion to pull support and stuff like that. So that did happen. But nevertheless, I have taken advocacy on the side of a lot of causes like Black Lives Matter, and that does get polarized even at a more mainstream level. So to where if you can't even say, hey, they have something good to say without any general conservative automatically classifying you as a liberal. I mean, it's the same way. I'm sure you've experienced this. Whereas if you just criticize something Trump does, they would call you a Hillary supporter.
Right.
Well, you must be in support of Hillary then. And this is routine. People do this all the time, and it's so shameful for Christians to behave this way. But unfortunately, that's the state of things now. Everything's so polarized. It's tribalism rules the day, and you can't make a biblical argument that cuts across both lines without people accusing you of something you're not. The same thing happens in our little Christian movements. If you take a particular position on something, somebody in the Baptist tradition is going to accuse you of being a Presbyterian, or some Calvinist is going to accuse you of being an Arminian, or an Arminian is going to accuse you of being a Calvinist. We used to do it, Evan, something I probably need to publicly repent of. When somebody expressed radical two kingdoms views, by which we would say people who say the civil realm has nothing to do with the church and God's word. It doesn't apply to the civil realm. That's all to be left to God's providence. We would call that radical two kingdoms, and we would say, hey, you guys, you're teaching that Lutheran theology, so go be a Lutheran. Well, that's not fair. And anybody's understood Luther and Melanchthon's writings on the civil government, it's not entirely fair, is it? Yeah. In fact, Melanchthon, I believe, wrote in justification of Calvin executing Servetus over blasphemy. Or of course, Calvin didn't execute him. Calvin was just a witness against him, kind of an expert witness. But even Melanchthon supported that. So okay, we're all complicit here in public execution over blasphemy. Does that mean?
Or I think Luther endorsed the execution of some Anabaptists. So
absolutely, they all did. And you can't say Luther didn't appeal to Mosaic law, because when he writes his treatise on usury, he exegetes the Old Testament law and says, well, this is why it applies and this is why it doesn't. So that's not fair to say that's Lutheran theology, not applying the law.
And at the time, right? I mean, he was living under a time, to put it simply, maybe there was no separation of church and state, and he was actually saying, wait a minute, there are different realms, and that's one point. Like say, and I was looking at the Bahnson book I've got here, I'm almost done with, and he talks about the Lutherans, and it's funny because normally we're sort of left out of all these conversations, but like one of the things like Bahnson, point he makes is that in the Old Testament, there is a distinction of church and state, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, in Old Testament law, kings didn't, offer sacrifices, and priests didn't execute criminals or whatever. So there in Old Testament, there are distinctions there, but most people just think, oh, Old Testament, it's just a big theocratic mess where they're just, everyone, there's no distinction between offices or roles. And that wasn't the case.
Let me speak to that, because I love that point where I agree with Luther. Of course, Luther popularized the two kingdoms. He didn't use kingdoms. He said two swords.
Because there's one
swords, the sword of the Spirit, which belongs to the church, and the physical sword, which belongs to the civil magistrate. And all he's doing to that extent is espousing what the Bible teaches, that there is a separation of church and state. So he was not coming up with anything new. And in fact, just like you said, that was in the heart and soul of the Old Testament law, that the priest could not usurp the role of the civil ruler, and the civil ruler couldn't go in and usurp the role of the priests. They were to be separate offices and accountable to God separately and independently. But the theonomic distinction would be, but they're both gods. And where I would disagree with Luther was I believe his official line on that was that the sword of the Spirit applies special revelation, what's written in the scriptures, to us. We're not allowed to do that for the civil realm. Although he wasn't that clear on that either. That's where the popular ideas come to say, well, the Bible doesn't apply to the civil realm. But that's not even Luther was meaning it that starkly. And when you get down to the details, the truth is Calvin's view on that was not much different than Luther's, because they both said, yes, we can apply the scriptures in the civil realm if the civil magistrate sees just, but he's not bound to do that. And my argument would be, no, he is bound to do that if he wants to be just in God's eyes. And that would be really the only distinction that really is worth talking about between two kingdoms. What is a biblical view of two kingdoms, and what are more traditional or less well-developed views of two kingdoms?
I think two kingdoms has evolved into secularism, right? Where basically it's two kingdoms is now synonymous with the idea that the secular state has complete autonomy, and that, of course, that's theonomy and autonomy.
That way by many people, yes, no doubt.
Yeah. It just is understood that the secular state has its own authority, like God gives us its own authority. And it's almost like, and they don't realize that between Luther and today, there was this whole thing of, the Enlightenment and all these other sweeping modernist, movements that have gone on to really define in many ways the secular state. And so there's that balance. It's back to what you mentioned before. There's that balance of, say, Romans 13 and Acts 4:05, where, yes, we're subject to ruling authorities, but we also obey God rather than men.
Yes.
You got to put those things and hold them in tension. And that's where that New Testament only pietism, even though both things I just quoted are from New Testament, but there is within evangelicalism and certainly within liberalism, not even an effort, not even a desire to try to figure out what that tension and balance looks like. It's just like, well, the state says this and I'll just go along with that. And the Bible says I got to act this way and I'll go along with that. And that's what bothers me, I guess. But to put a kind of bow on it a little bit, I mean, I do want to talk about the Doctor of Addictions, because that's
oh yeah, we should get to that.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. But just to kind of put a bow on it, I mean, what I would say is that, so as a latent conservative, I would say, if you look at the, say, Black Lives Matter platform, there are things that both you and I would disagree with. I mean, they
Yes.
in generally their worldview would be wholly secular.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. However, what frustrates me is when latent, instinctive conservatives view all movements with an equal amount of suspicion, maybe because their worldview is flawed. And they're not asking the hard questions of, but do these people have a legitimate complaint, if you will? And by complaint, I mean that in the highest sense of the word, as a defendant in court would have a complaint, right? A true victim.
Yeah.
And what I hear too much of, and what I appreciate that you're trying to do, is I hear a lot of just, they just equate all complaining, I guess, together. And what you're trying to do, and again, I'm not trying to be offer a hagiography here, but like what you're trying to do, what I see you trying to do is you're trying to say, biblically, let's try to listen to what people are saying today. And as I mentioned, and I don't have the name in front of me, but as we speak, there is this horrible case of this jogger in Georgia.
Yes, Ahmaud Arbery.
Thank you. And he's jogging, and we now learned yesterday this attorney videoed the shooting and thought it would exonerate these people who are tracking this guy down with a shotgun, murder him in cold blood. Yeah. And it's insane what's going on. So I don't want to make that the absolute norm of what goes on in America every day, which
right.
The media can kind of do, because I think we live in a country where it's the best country in the world in some ways, but it's really a dark country in other ways. I try to balance that out. But the point is that if you don't listen to what people of color have been saying for a long time, then you end up with this instinctive reaction when you have situations like this, where you're not sympathetic to the victim. And it strikes me that in biblical law, this is my summary statement, in biblical law, the victim gets a hearing.
Absolutely.
In statist situations, they don't. And so if we're going to be consistent and think about biblical law, even if you're not a theonomist with a capital T, That is something that you need to strive to do, and you need to evaluate. This is why I brought up case law, because you need to evaluate situations on their merits. And that's something that a lot of Christians, I don't think, will do either. They've got a worldview, they're conservative, and they've stopped doing the work of evaluating this on its merits and that on its merits, and what are the principles you would apply to each situation. And that's where kind of having a notion that there are different types of law, like there is such a thing as case law, which these were concepts I didn't even know before I heard that interview, for example. Really, I never even thought about it. And now I go, oh, okay, so this is a work of discernment, and you have to figure this sort of thing out. Let's do that rather than just being knee-jerk about everything. And what you found out is that when you do that, you unearth a lot of people who have camps and predilections that don't want to be questioned. Anyway.
Yeah, in fact, it's pretty much the norm for American life to be part of one tribe or another. And then in doing so, you react with a double standard. So if a tape comes out in which President Trump is talking about grabbing women by their private parts and how easy it is to get away with it, the conservative camp might say something like, well, we don't like that, but there's so much other good there to deal with. Whereas if something like the civil rights movement or Black Lives Matter comes around, they give it the exact opposite treatment, right? They find the smallest thing they can to condemn the whole thing. So there's this double standard that goes on. But the whole concept of the presumption of innocence comes straight out of biblical law. I mean, that is the presumption in biblical law, that if there are charges brought against somebody, you have to have two witnesses. In other words, the idea is you have to be able to prove the case against them. They're not guilty because you charge them. And that is a problem on both sides, again, in America, that we tend to try cases in the media and not in the courtroom. But if you look at it from, and of course, this is probably more common complaint among conservatives, because when a case like this happens and it's a Black person shot to death by white folk, it seems to go to the national media quickly, and then everybody forms opinion based on partial evidence or one video they saw or something like that. And so conservatives will complain, let the court system decide, let the justice system work. But the problem is, if this is where we need to listen to our Black brothers and sisters, so often the court system doesn't work for them. And I've spent a lot of my COVID-19 time, downtime here. When I do get to watch Netflix, watch things on criminal justice. And there's a lot of great series out right now put out by the Innocence Project. There's one called the Confession Tapes. There's one called the Innocence Files. And what you get is a sense over and over and over and over again how the criminal justice system fails people in its kind of zealous crusade to get convictions. And nowhere has that been more true with people of color in the South. And I watched a heartbreaking one the other night on, it's called the Trials of Daryl Hunt. I believe it's Daryl Hunt. The Trials of Daryl Hunt. And he was a Black man who was absolutely railroaded for a rape and murder case in North Carolina in the 1980s. And when the story gets retold long after the fact, you realize that they brought in jailhouse snitches who were Klansmen. There was one of the witnesses at the beginning was a Klansman, and they were using Klan code language as they were writing letters to the police chiefs and district attorneys. And of course, and then it turns out in the end, this guy's railroaded and he's exonerated. I believe it was through DNA evidence and basically they finally caught the guy who actually did it. But the gentleman lost 20 years of his life. Okay, so and what you learn is how easy it is for a Black man to be railroaded through the system, especially by an all-white jury and an all-white DA's office where you may have a few token Black individuals. Me even just telling the story like this will be condemned as by many in their reaction saying, well, that's what liberals have done to us. They've used guilt trips and played the race card to try to gain power in society. And the sad fact is, It is true. It is so easily documentable true for anybody who will look at the facts. And if we would just listen to each other, we can get rid of this problem of trying things in the media. We can get rid of this feelings of inequity on their side. It's going to take some time, but it takes engagement on our part. And that's the thing we just absolutely refuse to do. We refuse to engage in the discussions that need to be taking place.
Yeah.
I have said many times, and I've taken heat for it, that I think we should sit down across a table and have an open discussion about reparations. I'm not saying I believe that the government should take huge sums of money and just give it, but I want to hear what you feel and what you think, and I want you to put it on the table and tell me how much and why, and at least let us understand where you're coming from and what the problems are, and how you feel it's just that this is a solution. And then we can at least have a discussion. And some people on the right would say, well, no, you can't even have the discussion, because then that's conceding that socialism to them. I just don't believe that's the case. I don't see why we can't talk about it. At the very least, if it was nothing else, at least a show of goodwill. And I think it can be much more than that.
Yeah.
So
there's a podcast called Wrongful Conviction.
Absolutely. I would recommend that in the list as well.
Yeah. And probably a lot of overlap with the Netflix series as well. And, you know, and in fact, I think it was Michelle Malkin who like wrote something like recommending that podcast, which my mom forwarded to me, which I started to listen to. But, you know, and for whatever we think about Michelle Malkin or kind of firebrand conservatives like her, there are some, you know, who understand that sometimes to be an actual conservative, with certain principles of limited government, innocent until proven guilty, etc., means that some of your bedfellows are going to be maybe pretty radical liberals who are out there on the front lines defending innocent people. And so that's kind of the thing. Even if, you know, my congregation is, I would say, you know, we're all tend to be fairly conservative, but all pretty open-minded. But even in my situation, you know, if I were to talk about, because I am a conservative, you know, if I were to talk about the need as Christians to advocate for the wrongfully convicted, well, wait a minute, you know, now you're getting into, you know, legal territory here, you know, now you're kind of using the pulpit for kind of political ends. And so there would be work to just simply convict or help folks understand that, no, actually our biblical calling this is part of our biblical calling, you know, and it's not, we don't just leave it over there for other people to deal with, you know. But it's hard
for many people to separate politics from justice and government. And of course they do overlap hugely, but they are separate issues. You can speak to matters of justice and even policy without supporting a political candidate one way or another, or even supporting specific legislation. And that's all that's forbidden by the 501c3 and the IRS code. But the Bible calls us to talk about matters of justice.
I want you to know that I've told my children who just turned 9 and 11, I told them, if you're ever stopped by the police and questioning ever begins, there are 4 magic words you must say: I want a lawyer.
That's right.
So I'm doing my best, and my wife just rolls her eyes when I say things like that around the house. I'm like, what? I mean, have you ever listened to the Wrongful Conviction podcast? If they had said those 4 words,
don't talk to the police.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and people judge that as being anti-cop or anti-law enforcement, and it's not. It is pro-justice. It is the bedrock of our justice system. Don't talk to the police. And I want a lawyer. And I just read recently.
Don't talk to the police, by the way, is the name of your interview with the guy who wrote the book on case law.
Yeah, and he wrote a small little book on that, which is worth reading in itself too. His name is Brent Allen Winters. He's got his own website. Yeah. But there was a Supreme Court case not too long ago that said, under certain circumstances, police don't even have to read you your Miranda rights. You have to invoke those rights yourself for them to kick in. In some circumstances. So I would not hesitate. I want a lawyer, and I invoke my 4th and 5th Amendment rights to remain silent. Yes.
Yeah. And that's the thing about conservatives too, is that we are, by definition, we are intuitively law and order types. And
Yeah.
so, and yes, and yet we're also limited government types.
Yeah.
It's like, well, but the law enforcement is part of the government. And, you know, when you see something like, you know, ATF or not, I mean, SWAT teams and stuff, you know, arresting Roger Stone, who I think is probably a, you know, a creep and a weirdo in many respects. And I don't, you know, endorse the National Enquirer, but you also, you know, you should look at things like that as conservatives, and you should go, you know, or you look at the massive armaments that you know, government federal agencies have, you know, like,
Yeah.
you know, things like that. I even had a few members ask me if I've watched the Waco series on Netflix, which I haven't,
No.
but I've seen documentaries about it, and it's hard to look at that and not feel a lot of sympathy for the people in that compound, if not Koresh himself. And I'm saying I don't feel for Koresh. I do think he was at fault, and a lot of that could have been averted. On the other hand, anyway, those are things we don't get off. But I think that is our conundrum as conservatives. And what I appreciate about you is that I think you're trying to find some balance in those sorts of things, right? It's like, yeah, we believe in law and order, and yet we also are suspicious of, you know, some of our ruling authorities, and we want to find that balance there. But
Yeah.
tell me about your book.
I believe in law and order too much. I believe the law and order also ought to abide by law and order.
Right.
And I believe it's far too big and powerful according to what God's law would require. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if Obama had run up a $30 trillion deficit, or, you know, run it up to 30 trillion, we'd be, you know, forget tea parties. We need, you know, we need the British Revolution all over again, as you mentioned earlier, you know, with the Tea Party, and it's
doubt.
You know, so I think that what we want to be is consistent, you know, in our views. Tell me about the book that you wrote, The Doctor of Addictions. You had mentioned this guy to me in passing last time we were, I think, eating Mexican food here in Houston.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I stopped by there a while back, and takeout only, but it was still just as good. But anyway, tell me about that book and where people can find it, and where people can find you, by the way.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm going to have to come back down there just to go to that place again.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Great restaurant. Well, I'm currently right now I'm on social media. I'm also working with some friends, getting up some of my old articles from American Vision days, which, by the way, I resigned last year. We have a website called lambsrain.com, lambsrain.com. And we put up a lot of new content as well as my classic old content there. And I'm working on some new projects that are just not disclosed yet, but they're in progress. And like I said, I'm on social media, Facebook and Twitter. So interestingly, I was approached last fall on a road trip by a gentleman that I had written about years ago when his case broke. And he was a doctor. He's an Indian gentleman who'd been a doctor in the Boston area, and through incidents that were providential when he first arrived here looking for work in the medical field, he landed at in the realm of addiction treatment. And in very short order, he excelled at it, and he found himself heading up what at the time was an entire center of addiction treatments. And then in just a few years, he was actually vaulted again through Providence into work at basically directing the healthcare for the entire prison system in the state of Massachusetts. And his name is Punyamurtula Kishore, and we call him Dr. Kishore. And he was known affectionately by 100,000 people or more as the Doctor of Addictions. He over time he continually learned and applied, and he took his background in family practice, and then he had a degree in public health from Harvard Medical School, and then he had his specialty practice in addiction treatment, and he was constantly learning, applying, and he developed basically the most successful addiction treatment system there's ever been by far. When you compare it to the success rates as measured in actual sobriety, to things like Alcoholics Anonymous, certainly the methadone maintenance model, which is the prevailing model by far. They don't even talk about sobriety rates. They talk about maintenance, and basically what the methadone treatment is, which again is the majority, is that you bring in a heroin addict through the doors, or somebody who was on Oxycontin or something like that, who needs opiates. And they don't try to wean them off and make them sober again. They just maintain them on a level of state-approved what's called methadone, or they use Suboxone now. It's different drugs. So they basically they called it Uncle Sam's legal dope, and they just the person just stays on dope indefinitely, and they come in every morning or however often to get what doses they need, and then they just stay in a stupor for part of the day. And there's a road there in Boston that he would show us, and they're actually working on a documentary of all this now. They're called the Methadone Mile, where there's just drug addicts walking up and down the street on this stuff. That's by far the prevailing model. And then when you turn to other things like so-called the what do they call it? The kind of the peer system that Alcoholics Anonymous and others use. They just don't have high sobriety rates. They're very, very low, and the recidivism rate's very, very high. And the statistics that I put into the book, you can see how those things operate by their own admission. There was one internal memo that was passed around, in fact, I believe it was Alcoholics Anonymous. They didn't even start counting sobriety rates for the first month, because there was 80% or more of the people receded back into opiate addiction within the first month. And so what Dr. Kishore did was he asked, why is this the case? Why are we losing them in 4 weeks? And he studied the life of an addict, many addicts, over 4 weeks, and he found these patterns and triggers and everything else, and he accounted for all that. He had this intensive practice where he would assign mentors to his people to be with them constantly. And he since he had a background in family practice, he could prescribe drugs to help with the withdrawal symptoms and stuff like that. He developed this system of complete care of the individual, where he had sobriety rates, I forget exactly off the top of my head, they're in the little book I wrote, but they were far, many times beyond anything anybody else has done. He had members of high profile society, doctors, lawyers, judges, who were his clients. And he had members of the Boston Celtics that had either members on the team or family members who were saved through his practice, such that I believe it was in 2004, the Boston Celtics honored him at mid-court.
Wow.
They had a special civic ceremony, individual of the month they would honor, and they brought him in and honored him for the work he'd done in addiction care. And what happened, as best we can tell, is the authorities began to harass him constantly, and they began to nitpick, and they even tried to entrap him in a double mirror entrapment scheme, and he didn't fall for it. They didn't get him. And then they tried to say he was giving kickbacks to some local drug testing labs, and that turned out not to be true. And they tried every trick in the book to squash his practice. And in the end, what they did was they wore him down through lawyers until he was completely out of money. He was worn down, he was beaten down, and through an attorney proxy, they got him to sign a plea deal to one single charge of, I think it was like Medicare fraud or something. It was so first of all, it was what they were after him for to begin with. And it just, you can tell they were just after him to squash him. And the only thing they really wanted him to do was give up his medical license. And this was at the height of Obamacare, mind you, when millions of dollars are coming into the state, and the drug establishment is trying to carve up this money, and they're trying to funnel it off to the meth clinics, because this is big money, and the money eventually goes to the doctor's establishment, to the drug companies. And this is the best we can tell what the motives for this were. It was entirely corrupt.
In other words, you're saying the theory, I guess, would be that the methadone, what's the word?
Salesman.
Yeah.
They are.
enterprise. The whole
Yeah,
thing
yeah,
is,
it's a cartel almost. But
yeah.
so what happens when a guy starts a system in the state and it actually makes people sober? It starts drying up the market for this methadone and for the drugs they use to treat this stuff. And it just grew. Kishore grew so successfully. He was opening offices all down the Cape, all through the western part of the state. At one point, he had 52 local clinics.
Oh.
Because his theory was, you got to go where the addicts are. They're not going to drive to Boston to get treated every week. You got to go serve them in their local communities. And so he did. And he was becoming so successful. I think over the course of 10 years or so, he saw through all of his clinics something like 250,000 patients in the state of Massachusetts. And of course, that is a huge chunk of money coming out of the coffers of the state health establishment. So as best we can tell, it was a move to try to squash him as a quack, when in fact he was doing nothing but healing people. And so this guy came in our circles years ago through Martin Selbrede at Chalcedon Institute. He wrote some articles on his case and the injustice of it and the power of the state-run healthcare cartels and establishments. And I wrote an article at the time to try to popularize it and get some more traction. And then when I was visiting up there in the fall last year, he visited me in person, and we got to know each other, and he asked me if I would write a short biography of him and his case. Cool. So I did, and the result of that is a little book I wrote called The Doctor of Addictions. It's like all of my books we've been talking about, is on Amazon exclusively. And so you can get Bounds of Love, Problem of Slavery, Consuming Fire, all those books. And you can also get The Doctor of Addictions, now available for sale. And you can read his story and the things he accomplished, to the comparison to the establishment model. And this was meaningful to me, Evan, because I had done all this work on the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And this is one of the areas it's most broken, is when you come to the drug war.
Yeah.
There are a huge number of people sitting in jail and just had their lives completely trashed in every way, shape, and form because they got caught with opiates and an opiate addiction. I mean, if you go back, you remember Rush Limbaugh went through this. He went through the process so many of these people have gone through, of being given prescription opiates and being overprescribed them and becoming addicted to them, and then having, of course, he's a wealthy man and he's surrounded by good counselors and help. He was able to get the help that he needed to get off. But most people don't have that. And most people, it ends up destroying their family and their career, and they end up in jail and all kinds of stuff. And then, of course, when you run out of prescription drugs, what do? You start stealing them. The addiction takes over. You start going to things like heroin or other things. So
yeah.
And now there's this curse of the heroin that's on the streets is laced with something called fentanyl, which is much more potent, and people are overdosing this. The overdoses are spiking in all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, the opioid crisis now is the talk of the drug war. I mean, it's not about, you don't hear about the cocaine cartels coming out of Nicaragua or wherever, Bolivia, like you used to see in movies. Now it's the opioid crisis, and it's a homegrown crisis, and it's a major problem.
Yeah.
So
for a retrospective on the cocaine cartel, you watch Narcos on Netflix. But to understand the opioid problem, you watch The Pharmacist on Netflix.
Absolutely. I just watched that the other night too. Amazing.
Yeah, really good. When I think the end of the third episode, when the doctor who ran the pill mill, they actually got her to interview, I was shocked. And it was kind of sad, really, because she clearly seemed to have been in an accident and was diminished. Yeah. But was not ultimately held accountable, I think, for what she did. But the point is that you do look at that, and without being a conspiracy theorist, you go, wow, there are some very powerful forces at work here going on to keep this going. And in general, I want to be appreciative of the R&D that pharmaceutical companies do, because we do cure many things, and it's like whenever a pandemic comes along, we're aghast that someone hasn't just cured it already, which kind of indicates how spoiled we are about what we can do. Again, it's the best of times and worst of times. But on the other hand, you have legal heroin out there called OxyContin, and everyone's benefiting except the addicts. And anyway, that's where I a whole other topic, but that's where my libertarian streak I struggle with.
Yeah, and here's where, like, we get back to the topic we mentioned earlier, where we said if you don't have a private alternative in place, the state swoops in with what usually is some kind of an overbearing program, and that's what the war on drugs is. Yeah, I mean, it's not to deny we have a drug problem. Yeah, we do, but you can't throw the police and military at it and throw everybody in jail for it. It just causes more problems. And the private alternative, I went to this initially when I started conceiving all this work I was going to do on criminal justice. I said, there's got to be a private alternative to the drug war. You've got to have a way to get people off drugs. And through my research, I found this amazing organization in Italy called San Patrignano, which started out as a small camp for a handful of addicted kids that some guy started, and he brought them in. It wasn't just, you come live in these dorms and we keep you busy with activities. It was, you basically return these people to private life on a farm. And he taught them to plant and to grow and to raise animals and to do the work. And then he taught them trades, and then he taught them how to make cheese and how to make wine. And the next thing, this little operation of a single individual, I think it was beginning in the 70s, grew into what is today a self-sustaining community of, at any given time, 1,500 recovering addicts. Wow. They have never taken a dime of state money. They take no money from the state, none. Wow. They produce everything they eat in their cafeteria. Everything they produce and eat in the cafeteria is cooked and served by the residents. So everybody rotates and has jobs, and everybody learns trades, and they've expanded into computer skills and furniture making and everything you can imagine. Wow. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And the first time I saw it, Evan, you know what my first thought was? My first thought, forgive me for using the word, it was, this is what biblical slavery was all about. Okay, it wasn't slavery as we know it in the South. It was to take a person who was on hard times and hard luck and maybe even involved in crime, put them in a situation in which they're actually being rehabilitated to be a productive member of society. At the same time, they're under kind of custodianship to make sure you don't get back on drugs or whatever. And people go in there, they stay as long as they need. And I thought, this is amazing. This is what we should be doing. Yeah. And then my second question was, why is there only one of these in the world?
Ask Joel Salatin.
Yeah. So, I mean, these things all to me go together, and there has to be this growth and development of these kind of things all over the place. So when I learned what Dr. Kishore was doing for addicts, I was like, okay, now here's a guy who's got a real vision for what needs to be done and was actually doing it successfully. Yeah. He wasn't doing the same thing as San Patrignano, but he was being actively involved in people's lives and curing them all the way out to sobriety. So to me, all these things go together, and they fall like pieces in a puzzle to what does a free Christian society actually look like. Right. It's not just the civil laws and reforming the civil laws. And in fact, if you did do that, you would have chaos, and in no time you would have gangs and crime running things, and you can't have that. So we do need to reform the laws, and I will be outspoken about that, but it needs to be a comprehensive, unified vision of society.
Well, I think that's a great note to kind of wrap things up on. And I mentioned Joel Salatin, who runs a kind of massive farming operation. I say massive; it's kind of a family farming operation, but it reminded me of the Italian farming community there. It's like maybe if he could get into the sobriety business, we could put all that together, but I know he's got enough chickens on his plate. So, but hey, man, thanks very much for your time. Lamb's Reign, that's REIGN. Yes. That's where people can find your writings. And we didn't even talk about the debates we hosted here, but they're both on YouTube. They deserve more views. I think especially your debate with Richard Carrier really deserves a listen, because I think you did a really good job there of sort of, especially people know the background and some things that go on with Mr. Carrier, Dr. Carrier. I think you did a good job of exposing really the difference, because that debate is titled "Which Worldview Produces the Best World?" which at the end of the day, is I wanted to host that debate because I got tired of having abstract debates about whether God exists. That, the point that the tip of the spear is kind of where, where does the rubber meet the road here? Why are we arguing for this at all? Mm-hmm. And we're arguing for it because we actually do think it produces the best world, contrary to what people might think about us as Christians. So
yeah, no doubt.
Anyway, people need to study, I think, those debates, and I appreciate your time today. I'm sure your kids need some attention today, and as Georgia opens back up, you might be busier these days. Who knows? But
I hope.
I hear you, man. Well, all right.
Thanks a lot. We'll be in touch. Good to be on your show again.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.